David is going to talk to us on the period that, on some definitions of antiquity, simply skips between the important classical periods and then the Renaissance, when it's all revived. And I think we're talking briefly at the end of the last discussion about periodization and where does it start, where does it end. And I guess this will be one of the questions that we should really address. To what extent does ancient history simply continue straight into the Middle Ages, or to what extent do the Middle Ages simply extend all the way back to prehistory, for all we know? And I'm sure there are many other aspects that David will address too. So, David.
Good. I need to have this thing.
I'm afraid you probably do.
Yes. Okay. I wasn't at the lecture yesterday, but I have read the paper with pleasure and profit, and I've also read the paper from our distinguished visitor from Peking, and I will allude to those as I go along, though my brief, as Hans gave it to me, was to talk about antiquity in the Middle Ages, but I think it does all tie together. So first of all, I think we just need to stand back and make a couple of obvious points about how we use concepts. As you see from the handout, the social scientists, anthropologists, historians distinguish between emic and etic concepts. That is to say, the concepts of the people that we're studying, the emic concepts, and the concepts of the analytical observer, the historian or anthropologist, social scientist. And we need to think about in which sense we're using the trio of antiquity, Middle Ages, and indeed modern. In fact, in my own view, one really needs to add a third to this trio. There's the concepts of the people we're studying, which are almost invariably, well, they're part of what we study. They're, in a way, the key part of what we study, but they are confused and fuzzy, as people's concepts as they battle their way through lives tend to be. Then there's the concepts of our own society, 21st century Britain, America, wherever, and these are also confused and fuzzy. And neither sets of concepts are fit for purpose for scholarly analysis, because they're not designed for it. They're designed for getting by in their own period. So the third set of concepts are the concepts which, I guess, are etic concepts in the thin sense, which are the concepts that we scholars devise in order to understand what we study. And I think it's very important to segregate these from the concepts of our own time, in that they are created for a purpose, and that purpose is to study the past. So they are often very similar to the concepts of our own time, but not absolutely the same. So if you take a couple of Weberian concepts, the concept of a pariah people sounds very negative, but in fact what it means is a people, or indeed an individual, who is the underdog, who's oppressed, who can't fight back for the moment, but knows that their people's time will come. And that's a very transferable concept. Or again, Weber's concept of charisma. It's not one of magnetism, but it's the belief by the followers of a person, in the case of personal charisma, that that person has extraordinary powers. So these are slightly specially defined concepts, and they're defined in order to give you the sort of precision you need to understand the past. And that is what I mean by etic concepts in this sense. And I say that because otherwise people say, if you don't, you cannot escape from the concepts of your time. Well, in a way you can, because you can create concepts in the hothouse of your own academic subculture, and that is very different from your own time, from the world out there. Okay, so how does this map onto our debate today? Ancient, medieval, and modern. Well, first up, these are clearly emic concepts. I mean, their origin is in the societies we study. They're not concepts that were invented by modern intellectuals or scholars in order to understand the past. They're a product of the past. And secondly, they are a rather peculiar product of the past in that the concept of the ancient was developed about 1,000 years after antiquity as we now understand it. So the concept of antiquity or of the ancient world is developed by humanists. I'm not going to throw around the word Renaissance too much. That's another very thick, seamy concept, full of confusion. But let's say humanists who are guys who are keen to propagate a new academic and school curriculum. And this is the school curriculum that was alive and well until not all that long ago. Two of my colleagues who went to St. Paul's with three other people, with Martin West, Michael Crawford, John North, John Cameron, Cameron anyway. They all studied Latin and Greek from the age of about 5. They learned how to translate in and out of Latin and Greek and to write Greek verse, etc. And they are the last heirs of the effort made by humanists to define themselves against something in the past. And what they were defining themselves against was a different kind of academic curriculum, based more on philosophy, based more on problem solving, in a way a much more hard-edged and analytical and less deferential to authority type of curriculum, but nevertheless less literary. So the concept of antiquity is the product of these people who wanted to mark out their style of intellectual activity as different from one that they wanted to shove out of the university curriculum, which they did with incredible success and a remarkable degree of ideological neutrality, in that by the 17th century, whether you were a Dutch Protestant or a Bavarian Jesuit, you were teaching pretty much the same school curriculum, studying the same texts, and this went on up until the time when, in the Second World War, Patrick Leigh Fermor could, when he captured a German general, could start quoting Horace, and the German general could finish the quotation for him. So, this was a big event in cultural history, and out of it came the notion of antiquity, because antiquity was what they were recovering. Up until that point, nobody had known that there was an antiquity. In the Middle Ages, people had no idea that there was antiquity. As far as they were concerned, there was a continuity between them and what we call the ancient world. When the Holy Roman Empire had been revived and then re-revived by German kings, every now and again they passed constitutions. And those constitutions were added to the corpus, the Justinianic corpus of Roman law, just as if they were Roman emperors, like Trajan or Hadrian. And there was no sense that they were any different. As far as they were concerned, their Roman imperial constitutions were part of a continuum going back to the Roman Empire. And so a medieval corpus juris civilis, in fact, includes these. And they would be taught and lectured on in universities by Roman law professors, just in the same way that what we would consider Roman law was taught and studied. So they didn't have any sense that they were the Middle Ages and that there was antiquity. If they did have a sense of a break, it would be with Constantine and with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And they had a clear sense that that really did make a difference. They were perfectly well aware of the pagan world. When Aristotle's substantive philosophy was discovered and burst on an astonished world, they knew very well that they were dealing with an alien thought form. They knew very well that Aristotle believed that the world had always existed, the universe had always existed, and they treated that as another. And for them, the gap would be, the caesura would be, the break would be with Christianization. So, inside this trio of ancient, medieval, and modern, you can see that it's not something that appears as soon as the ancient world ends. It's something that comes on right at the end of 1,000 years after what we call the end of the ancient world. And this process flows into the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, in which some thinkers said we are better than the people in the ancient world, and other people said that the ancient world can't be beaten in anything that it did. So by that time, the concept of antiquity is absolutely on the map of everybody. Now, I think this is quite relevant to Professor Wang Mingming's paper, because this particular process doesn't map at all onto what we find in China, as you so skillfully described. I mean, it was a beautiful paper. I read it with great intellectual pleasure. And of course, you do show that there is the notion of an ancient. But there is no equivalent to this notion of a Middle Ages in between. And no equivalent, as far as I can see, you must correct me if I'm wrong, to the creation of the ancient precisely in contradistinction to an intervening period, as it were, an instrument with which to beat a previous academic curriculum. So in this scheme of things, when people in China do talk about ancient and modern, it's ancient and modern, rather than ancient, medieval, and modern. Now, moving on to etic concepts, Professor Morris also actually moves pretty seamlessly from ancient to modern. There isn't really any space for anything in between in the paper that I read, and again, with tremendous pleasure. The ancient world, of course, goes back a long way, and it extends right up to, well, the date varies from place to place, but nonetheless, really the understanding is that you are ancient until you're modern, or that you move into it. So that's a different analytical framework, but it is an analytical framework that's very different from that emic concept that was developed by the Renaissance humanists. That very unmedieval schema of ancient, medieval, and modern. Well, the very fact that I say that the schema is unmedieval and that I do use the word medieval on a daily basis shows that I do think, in fact, that the notion of the Middle Ages and the medieval does have some point. That is to say, I do think it's a not totally useless etic concept. It's an ideal type, in the sense that it is one of those words that we use because we have to get to grips with the infinite complexity of the past. This is really what all ideal types are doing as you face this just mass of facts, infinite numbers of happenings. You couldn't even describe what you did and thought in one day yourself. So how are you to get a grip on thousands of years of history? You do this by simplifications, and then you move out from simplifications to more accurate representations. So your ideal type is like a sketch map, which you constantly improve on and elaborate. I guess by the fact that I use the word medieval, I show that I don't really think that a twofold schema of ancient and modern is adequate for all purposes. And I suppose you can only adopt a schema like that if you focus on really a very materialist conception of history, if you keep things down to the economy and the ability to fight wars. Once Professor Morris got on to religion, I thought he began to be on rather shaky ground. I mean, he says, I think I quote the phrase in my handout, that bureaucratization and commercialization made the idea of god-kings just too implausible. Well, You think of Roman emperors. In the West, only god-kings after their death, and the famous quotation from the Roman emperor when he was dying, "Oh dear, I'm becoming a god." But in the Greek East, of course, the emperor is a godlike figure. So I think this sort of schema doesn't work particularly well for religion. But quite apart from that, I think it leaves out too much of what historians, and especially historians of religion and culture, but also actually material historians, consider important. And this is what we call the Middle Ages. So I would defend a periodization which does distinguish the Middle Ages from antiquity. Though I wouldn't make too large a claim for it, but it seems to me that it's something worth doing. Actually, I feel almost apologetic about it because what it tells you is too elementary and too obvious. What it enables you to put your finger on is that there is a massive decline in material well-being round about the 6th or 7th century. It, more importantly, I think, draws your attention to the breakdown of the imperial taxation system. There is a system of the Roman Empire which you could crudely describe, as many of you know better than I do, as a system by which you suck taxes out of a very large area, bring them to the center, and use them to pay for roads and legionnaires who control that large area. And once that central taxation breaks down, then you have a different kind of world. People didn't always realize it. Merovingian kings continued to collect taxes for quite a long time after they were necessary in order to pay legionnaires, and they just used to accumulate them in barns. More and more bullion would be accumulated in barns because they assumed that this is what you did if you were a king. But the system had fundamentally changed by then. So I think that is a point that is worth marking in our terminology. But it's a very crude one. I mean, you don't need any analytical insight to see that some pretty major things change in the West with the barbarian invasions. And you don't, obviously, need to be reminded that it didn't happen in the East. These are just well-known facts. Nonetheless, they are convenient for purposes of organizing curricula, for organizing syllabuses, when you're discussing replacement of colleagues, etc. You usually have to think in terms of what period you're replacing. And if you are trying to present hundreds of years of history to undergraduates and who have to learn it all very fast, you need to have some sort of structures of that kind before you go further. And similarly, at the other end, where you're going to end it all, you could say that you should end it with humanism. But actually, I wouldn't say that. I mean, the point at which the humanists create antiquity is not actually a really fundamental change in culture or society. It's a change in the educational curriculum and in the image of history, but not really in the rest of society. All that sort of book art stuff about the spirit of the discovery of the individual and the world and man is pants mostly, really. I mean, it's there isn't really a fundamentally different worldview. There isn't really a new secularism. Most of the subjects of Renaissance painting are religious for a long time, and Renaissance humanists, the presents they give to each other are often presentation copies of Augustine or Ambrose or the Fathers. Somebody like Machiavelli with his strident secularism, or one or two people in the Florentine Renaissance who are reacting against Christianity, are really very exceptional. On the whole, this world of humanism just takes on the colouring of the society around it. It's somebody with a new kind of education who gets top administrative jobs, and that person will write propaganda for a republic, or for a signore, a dictator, or will write Protestant works of polemic, or Catholic works of polemic. It's not in itself a fundamental change. Most other things go on the same. But the real change, of course, is so obvious that, again, you don't need anyone to tell you. It's the Reformation. I mean, the Reformation really does make a massive change to Europe. It changes the belief system of half of Europe. It changes the balance of power between church and state in the other half of Europe. But, this is not a clever thing to say. It's an obvious thing to say. So this sort of periodization, I think, is just a handy way for practical purposes, for elementary courses, etc. But it doesn't have any deep interpretative significance. Now, that is worth saying, because if you go back 100 years, people really did think that periodization had deep interpretative significance. And this assumption did produce, in fact, some very fine works of history. Although I was a bit scornful of Burckhardt's Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, still a historical classic. And an even better historical classic is Huizinga's, I can never pronounce his name. Is there anyone Dutch in the room? Thank you. Very good. Yes. I can always say it when somebody says it to me, and then the next time I try and say it, it comes out wrong again. His Waning of the Middle Ages is also within this framework that periods have a deep significance. And what he is saying in the Waning of the Middle Ages, or the Autumn of the Middle Ages, is that this represents the end of a period. And there is a whole ideology of history behind this language. And the ideology is the notion that somehow every period has got, as it were, a center, a formula which sums up the structural similarities between art and literature and law and politics. Somehow it all comes together in a central point. And Burckhardt with the Renaissance, or Huizinga with the Waning of the Middle Ages, were describing respectively the beginning of a period or the end of a period, but they thought that period had a unity. And actually, although I think it's a mistaken view, it did produce good history because it forced people to make connections between different layers. And that is one of the things that does produce good history, is when people are actually trying to get outside one particular slice of life and connect it with other slices, as it were, intellectual history with economic history, that usually produces interesting results. So it was a very fruitful era. Nonetheless, it was based on a Hegelian assumption that there is a sort of spirit of the age. This was beautifully taken apart in Ernst Gombrich's The Task of Cultural History. I've got a little American edition of this, which has a cover with a picture of a wheel, and around the wheel is sort of music, art, literature, customs, law, politics, etc. The ends of the spokes, and then there's the center of the wheel. And this is the Hegelian idea that ages have a sort of center to them. Hegel also thought that peoples had a kind of spirit to them too, and it's very difficult to see how those two things are reconciled. But in fact, if you're not a Hegelian, this is a completely gratuitous assumption and deeply implausible, because if you think of almost any age, there is no one formula to which it can all be reduced. Think of our own period. All right, there are things. There is one sort of formula, which is a belief in freedom, the individual, democracy, perhaps some level of capitalism, human rights. That's one formula. But Islam, Catholicism, Buddhism, those are just as much part of our time as the little package of concepts and ideals that I've mentioned. And obviously they all interconnect with each other. But you can't say that any one of them is the essence of our age. Personally, I like the idea of what I call the weak Zeitgeist principle. Something I proposed long ago, and nobody took the slightest bit of notice of it, to my astonishment. But I still think it's got something going for it, which is the notion that at any given period there isn't one Zeitgeist, but there may be half a dozen formulae which actually do capture very large parts of life at the time. And those formulae are not reconcilable with each other necessarily. They can't be brought into any kind of unity. But nonetheless, they are like a Zeitgeist in that they do bring together, many different layers of life. And you just have to accept that there isn't only one of them. And then the Zeitgeist principle becomes quite valuable again. But of course, it ceases really to be a key to periodization. And for that reason, I don't think that we should attach too much significance to periodization. Actually, the last bastion of this conception of history, of course, is Marxist history. Because Marxist history also believes that there is a sort of last analysis, and that in any, when you're kind of in the middle of a phase of history, you can bring things back in the final analysis to slavery or feudalism or capitalism or whatever it is. And of course, Marxist history can be staggeringly sophisticated and involve huge amounts of attention to ideas and culture. But the phrase "the last analysis" will be the giveaway that ultimately this all can be explained in terms of a social and economic substructure, and that eventually it will be displaced by changes at the level of social and economic substructure. And this idea extended far beyond Marxism, actually. If you look at historians of the 60s, for example, somebody like Lawrence Stone at Princeton. But in fact, most historians, the going model of the time would be that there would be a particular social and economic substructure, and if the political superstructure didn't keep up with it, then you'd get a revolution. And these were people who, had never been a member of the Communist Party or anything like it, but nonetheless they went with that kind of model. So I think that within Marxism you still have this sort of notion that there is a central point which gives identity to a period. But then again, one says, why should there be? Why should there be one thing that gives unity to a period? It's just an assumption. There's no obvious proof of it. You just read it into the past. I think a big problem with that assumption is that it tends to tune out very long-term developments. And I think that the key problem with taking periodization too seriously, not using it just as a crutch, but treating it as a kind of a major intellectual resource for analyzing the past, a really good ideal type as opposed to a rather crude and basic ideal type, is that it distracts attention from those things that run right through different periods. And Eleanor was talking about this as one of the things that tends to get left out, precisely the things that run right through, perhaps from the antiquity into the Islamic world. And these are things that we, as historians, should be looking at, which we haven't done enough, I think. I mean, the idea of the longue durée was absolutely all the rage after the war, but it was really very much focused on social and economic history. I mean, it was pioneered by Brodel's great book on the Mediterranean, and his interests were really in social and economic history. So he was looking at, patterns of the movement of sheep across Italy, or how long it took to cross the Mediterranean over hundreds or thousands of years, but not particularly at culture. And it seems to me that it should be an uncontroversial point, but we need a longue durée questionnaire for cultural history also. I don't think this is particularly common. It has existed in the form of the history of unit ideas. If you think of something like Lovejoy's old book on the Great Chain of Being. So people have traced the history of certain ideas right through time, and they've done that. But that's rather remote from social history, generally. And I think that perhaps what we need is a longue durée history which brings together intellectual history and social history and cultural history, so that we can see the development, as it were, going down into society without simply subsuming it into the social and economic. I think that a useful concept for this, in fact, is the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann's concept of autopoiesis, self-making. He sees society as being made up of not society not as being a system, but of being made up of an almost infinite number of systems of one sort or another, so that something like the history of ethics could be a system, or ethical inquiry. And he sees these systems as, in some sense, self-contained. They have a life of their own, but and they do have structures of expectations, but those can change. And they're like a conversation that rambles on through time. And I think some intellectual history could be reformulated in that way. So you're not just studying the history of one idea, but you're studying how, as it were, you set the parameters of a conversation and then it continues through time. So I think that would be true of the history of ethics, for example. But what I really want to talk about is some of the continuities between antiquity and the Middle Ages, and in particular, the religious continuities. Now, I put on your handout a brilliant quote from Perry Anderson as a footnote to his passages from Antiquity to Feudalism, which I guess is about antiquity and the Middle Ages. And I thought it was extremely honest footnote. It was in a footnote, not in the main text, in which Perry Anderson, who is working, of course, in a Marxist framework, points out that nobody has really focused on the way in which Latin Christianity has retained an identity from the ancient world through the Middle Ages into the early modern world, and so on. And this seems to me a really serious object of inquiry, and I think he was on the money in drawing our attention to it. And what we need to do is have a questionnaire that leads us to interesting continuities. So, firstly, this is quite a deep history. For example, the idea of structuring the week around the Sabbath obviously goes deep back into the Jewish past, as do some of the other things I'm going to talk about. And this, of course, is so much part of life one doesn't even think about it. But the idea that you build the week around a day of rest and add to it layers of significance, namely that the Sunday represents the day of the resurrection. I mean, this is a very fundamental way of structuring time. And it goes back to some point in the ancient world before the conversion of Constantine, and it continues right throughout the Middle Ages. It gets enhanced in Protestant Europe and is still with us today. The structuring of the year, actually, the structuring of chronology in terms of the Common Era, as we now call it. I always thought, what an astonishing thing that the year 2000 was celebrated magnificently in Beijing. This date, which means nothing except in terms of the chronology that is based on the birth of Christ. I mean, this shows how a way of structuring time has become dominant in areas where the belief system that gave rise to it has no purchase whatsoever. So, again, this is a very deep structure. Similarly, the whole structure of the year around festivals, around Easter and around Christmas, this is a phenomenon of antiquity. I couldn't say when it begins, but by the time I begin to pay attention, which is the 4th century A.D.
Several millennia before that.
Right, okay. But it's... and of course the meaning of the festivals change. But by the 4th century, the meaning of Easter, the meaning of the Christmas, of course, is a particularly interesting case because it takes on the meaning of the birth of Christ, and then it's lost it again in our own time, and has become the time when you watch Second World War films on television. And which is not entirely sensible. I once raised this with one of my undergraduate classes and said, have you noticed how they always put on Second World War films? And one of the students very astutely said, yes, because they're all about community, sticking together. So actually, there is a sort of logic running through it. Nonetheless, if you take the idea of Easter and Christmas from late antiquity through to, I don't know, some point in modernity, for most people, they did actually have significance as representing the resurrection of Christ or the birth of Christ, with all the concepts that went around that. And so that went beyond just the fact that you were having a particular time of year. The layers of meaning were a common factor going through time. That's something that breaks right through this antiquity barrier. Similarly, the way of structuring dogma, I think, is very distinctive to Christianity as a religion. Though this is the kind of thing I say, hoping to get pushback, but something like what the Council of Nicaea did. Council of Nicaea in the 320s, very bothered by the question of whether Jesus Christ is absolutely God in the same sense as God the Father, or whether he is just one fractional level below. And all these bishops, brought there by the imperial postal service, which was indispensable for an ecumenical council, discuss this and bring into play concepts from Greek philosophy in order to try and reach a creed. So creeds are a phenomenon of late antiquity, when the Roman emperor is still going up and running. It's very difficult to find anything quite like a creed, I think, in other religious systems. It's like an obligatory collective belief. Now, you find tremendously elaborate theological religious ideas in all of the major religions, but these complicated attempts to resolve paradoxes of the religion in a formula, like how can you have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and yet one God, or how can Jesus be God and be man at the same time? The attempt to actually collectively reach a formula which summarizes those things and says from now on this is what everyone has to believe. This is something that is up and running in the ancient world and continues right through. The formula reached by the Nicene Creed, or the Council of Chalcedon, if you can push antiquity a little bit further for the natures of Christ, fascinatingly, this is absolutely accepted by the Lutherans and the Calvinists. So the Reformation, these solutions, which were so controversial in their day, continue to be common ground between the Catholics and the Protestant Reformer opponents. This is a battle. Pardon?
Not the Orthodox.
No. The Nicene bit.
Yeah, but there was the split in 1054 was a part on the question of the nature of God.
There wasn't really a split in 1054. Actually, the real split was in 1204 with the Fourth Crusade. That was until then until they didn't think of themselves as being a separate religion. The peculiar nature of the clergy, and this is common to Orthodox and Catholic religions, this highly structured clergy, this tremendously hierarchical clergy. The best conceptual scheme for understanding it is, I think, Louis Dumont's Homo Hierarchicus, applied to the caste system in India. And obviously, it's totally different in that it's not hereditary in the same way. But the notion of hierarchy of difference somehow as being a good thing rather than as being discriminatory. And the many levels of the clergy. This, again, is a huge continuity that runs right through late antiquity, and of course is heavily influenced by Judaism. We had in our department who was that Wertzeger, who worked on Babylon. I think she pinpointed the moment when that came into Judaism, that sort of very hierarchical structure. So actually that's a notion of the priesthood which goes back to Babylon and continues century after century in the Middle Ages, out of the Middle Ages, and on. The very high degree of condensed symbolism, to borrow Mary Douglas's phrase, of the rituals of Christianity in late antiquity, again, and with the Greek Orthodox Church, can continue right through. Monasticism is a product of late antiquity and continues right through. Canon law, the collection of canon law texts, the idea that you regulate life by that the clergy regulates their life by canon law texts. Again, these are the product of late antiquity. The first papal decretal is towards the end of the 4th century, Pope Siricius to Humerius of Tarragona. Nobody then knew that the empire in the West was going to collapse. So all of these things are continuities that run right through. And where these things are concerned, the Antiquity, Middle Ages division makes no sense, in my view. So for that reason, I think perhaps we should treat this sort of periodization as a crutch that we kick away and pay just as much attention as Eleanor Robeson was saying to those things that run right through. I wanted to add just one last thought about the particular way that we do this sort of global history. And this is more a statement of kind of my personal view of history than something that I can sort of declaim with any authority. But I'm really not happy with this developmental approach to world history. This idea that there are stages that every society that goes through. And I realize this is in direct contradiction to Professor Morris's paper, though not necessarily. I mean, and I would strongly advocate instead the approach of the mature Max Weber. Now, the mature Max Weber is often thought to have had a developmental notion of history. And he's usually presented as seeing history as leading up to modernization, bureaucratization, and so forth. In fact, I think, and that probably was the problem he began with, but that is not what he was doing at the end of his life. And if you look at his Wirtschaft and Gesellschaft, actually, he's doing something different. He's doing a different kind of global history. What he's doing is global analytical history. And the difference between analytical history is that chronology is not your framework. Your framework is thematic. So he would say, take a topic like bureaucracies, and then he would say there have been 5 great bureaucracies in world history. And then he would list them, the ancient Near Eastern bureaucracies, the later Roman Empire, the medieval church, the patrimonial state. And then, from then, he would go on to look at the differences between the bureaucracies. But basically, he was not trying to suggest that there were stages that every society went through. Instead of which, he was trying to provide concepts which structure comparative inquiries about different societies. Now, it seems to me that Professor Morris's approach could well be adjusted to do exactly that. I mean, the idea that it's an ideal type, that unless you have a developed state, you can't have an empire. Well, yeah, I mean, that does make sense. There's no reason, though, to make that a stage that societies have to pass through. And I think that probably the main danger of this sort of ancient, medieval, modern periodization is precisely that it, despite the fact that we all gave up the idea of progress generations ago, it's still there, this notion that somehow we are working our way through to a more modern and more progressive future. And I think that's something we need to get away from by looking more at continuities, and especially by doing our global history analytically and comparatively rather than as a sequence of our gradual ascent towards our own glorious present. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very eloquently for longue durée history and many other things besides. An important challenge to Ian's ideas and to the whole concept of antiquity. Again, I do believe I saw our tea arriving in the corner of my eye. But, we do have time for some questions. So, okay, we'll program.
The one term you didn't use was civilization.
That's true.
So I wanted to ask you, is Zeitgeist civilization?
No, to me, a Zeitgeist is an attitude of mind that shows itself in unexpected places in different departments of life. So it might be a certain dualism of secular and religious overlapping together, which might show itself in the kind of text that people write, but also in the conception rulers have of their duties. So it's anything that runs through different levels of life. So in fact, if you take sort of Gombrich's, the wheel with the things around it, a zeitgeist could be like that, except you just don't assume there is one per period.
He used the word culture.
Yeah, he used the word culture. I think he was using it in a fairly broad sense. I mean, I must confess, I'm not really getting in. I'm not thinking of just high culture. I'm thinking of continuum of culture and society, and I'm not actually really sure about this notion of civilization. I think this was something that somebody in UCL came up with, that we should have. And somebody, not probably, I mean, I hope, did the person who come up with this in this room? Yes. Okay, sorry, I beg your pardon. It is contestable, because if you take something like the work of Evans Pritchard on the Newer, for example. Now, this is an illiterate society. By the time he had finished writing about the Newer, he said he had learnt far more from them than they ever could from him. And of course, the Newer have long since turned into Kalashnikov-toting marauders. But at that time, who is to say that's not civilization? And of course, if that's civilization, then where is the line between civilization and non-civilization? So I think it's a good concept to get us talking, but I wouldn't particularly use it as a structuring concept of my own work. Sorry, Marie, I didn't realize that you were defending it. I'm not really against it.
It's creative. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you see any useful distinction between the developmental approach, which you criticize, and an approach in terms of one or two transitions. And the classic ones that would come to an economist would be the agrarian revolution and then the industrial revolution, and particularly the latter, where you might characterize the period unifying antiquity and early modern as one in which there might be periods of prosperity or poverty, but you never broke through to exponential growth.
Yeah.
And in terms of another recent book by Angus Deaton called The Great Escape, where he's looking not just at the achievement of material well-being, but also of much greater levels of health and longevity. Again, there's a very great distinction between the life expectancy in nearly the whole world today and what would have been the case in periods before the Industrial Revolution.
What was the other concept? The Industrial Revolution. What was the other revolution?
Well, and then
I just didn't hear it.
I mean, I suppose Gellner's term, but I think Professor Morris referred yesterday to the agrarian,
the agrarian revolution.
Yeah, so you the move from foragia to agraria.
No, I mean, obviously, I'm not denying the extreme importance of those changes. Again, it's kind of a no-brainer that both of those things transformed history. And I suppose to that extent, you can see a process. So the Industrial Revolution one of them happened so far back in the past that it's before most of what we study. And the other, in a sense, happens in Britain, first of all, and then sweeps the world by conquest and imitation. So it's hard to see it as something that every society would go through. That's to say, we will never know whether, if industrialization hadn't happened in Britain or in Europe, whether other countries would have got to it eventually. We'll never know. How can we ever know? So we can't really see this as a sort of stage that's built into human development. So we're left with the agrarian one, which I grant you, but it was a long time ago.
I suppose one follow-on aspect I make, and this is something I think economic historians are more comfortable with than general historians, but the sort of notion of counterfactuals.
Yeah.
And, it is, I think, meaningful, or at least within economic history, to say that there was a close-run thing with Industrial Revolution in Sung China, and also that if it hadn't happened in Britain, it probably would have happened in the Low Countries or France. Right. And that's not something that economic historians would rule out of court. They might say it's undecidable, but it's still debatable.
No, I'm completely happy with that. I have no problem with counterfactuals if they're framed in that kind of way, when you get to the point of showing that something plausibly could have happened. And I can quite see that in those two cases, I could well see, so partly retracting what I said, I think you could say that the conditions were almost there. I'm very struck, actually, there's a throwaway line in Weber's Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft where he points out the significance of a patent law. Because if you have a patent law, then people actually can make a profit out of their inventions. Whereas if you don't, then they're just entertainment. But I'm not denying that. In fact, I do believe in counterfactuals. I don't know why historians are so against them. I think it's because the wrong sorts of historians get publicity for advocating them. But there's a wonderful book by a Cambridge sociologist, Plausible Worlds, Geoffrey Hawthorne. I don't know how many people come across that. Never made a big impact. Absolutely superb. I think pretty much a knockdown defense of counterfactuals. So I don't have a problem with that, and I agree. You could easily convince me that, say, China was at a point where it probably would have happened if it hadn't been swept aside by the West.
Okay, I think we could go on, and we will go on, but perhaps later, because the tea will be getting cold next door.
Yes.
It should be in room 23 next to this. But before we do the drink tea, let's thank David.